Stuart, but she disappeared. I don't know where she went. So, all right, what I'm going to start off with is actually Ken this morning. Ken has an update on our Breaking Bread guy, Ray. Thank you guys very much for those of you sent notes or cards of encouragement to our former alumni, Ray. I really appreciate that personally, because if you had been stuck in a hospital for 60 days, I think that would be a downer for any of us. And I'm sure it helped Ray getting some notes of encouragement, some cards from us. So thank you guys. Take it away, Ken.
Actually, it did help Ray an awful lot, and he greatly appreciates all the cards and the notes, the kind words, but especially the prayers, which he desperately desires us to keep up. Ray is down to only 23% oxygen, which is great. He continues to be extremely weak. And when I was talking with him, every so often he would just go, oh, oh. And I asked him, Ray, what's that about? And he said, I have to be so careful how I breathe because I've already aspirated twice. Now, when you aspirate, you are breathing and you accidentally bring up some of the stuff in your stomach that goes to your lungs, and that's not a good thing. So he has to time his breathing when he talks to people. So instead of just talking like you and I do, we just talk right off the cuff. He has to think before he says anything. So he times his breathing and he gets the exact amount of air that he needs to use to talk, which is extremely frustrating. The thing that he and I talked about, though, was music, and about how he's so glad that he is getting back his bass voice. And I told him too. And he said, but before that, though, I need to get my life back. And I said, yes, you do. And that's exactly what we are praying for. He continues to be in Kindred Hospital. Pastor Paul from his church continues to visit him once a week. And his daughter has been coming by throughout his entire time to cheer him up too. He's extremely anxious about getting out, very much wants to be doing things, but he just doesn't have the strength. It's all he can do to do the therapy, but he doesn't see the therapy working. And I said, oh, Ray, just listening to your voice, I can tell you're getting stronger.
Right.
And he says, well, I'm glad you can, because I can't.
Yeah.
He has grown to really enjoy bananas and grapes for breakfast. Now he craves them. And he still has his sense of humor, but and he always appreciates the prayer at the end of our talk. So
Thank you, Ken.
that's
Thank
it, guys.
you. Let's just keep Ray in our prayers and continue to pray him through this as he has lingering effects from his bout with COVID. Get him out of the hospital, get him home. Dana, while I still have the mic here, Ned's not with us today. Do you have any updates on Ned? Is he continuing to get better, get stronger?
I haven't seen him personally. That's one of the things it's on my list to do.
Okay.
I've had a unusual week.
Okay.
Past 2 weeks actually. So, but yeah, it's on the list. I just don't know the answer, but I hope to get something before we meet next week.
Well, I saw him on oxygen last week from his COVID battle, so I didn't know if he had gone backwards or what the straw. I'll reach out to him. All right, guys.
I do see him driving around in his truck, so he must be getting out.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Good.
All right, guys. Last week, we finished up that series, 3 weeks, and we spoke about you standing in the gap in intercessory prayer, remember? So this week, what I'm going to have you do, mute yourselves so we eliminate the background noise. And we're going to go to Ezekiel chapter 23. I'm going to go through the whole chapter. This is a long chapter. However, the way I'm going to do it, I should be able to fit it in, no problem, and get us out of here by 1 o'clock. Famous last words. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from chapter 23 out of a paraphrased version of the Bible. Now, I've done this before in the past periodically. Mostly I study out of the New King James Version. Again, I have about 8 pages of notes. If you guys have questions at the end of this about anything in there, I have notes on it. But what I'm going to do, the format, I'm going to read it through a paraphrased version because this chapter is very self-explanatory. I'm going to read it out of the New Living Translation this week. And then if you have any questions, I will answer them specifically out of the New King James Version, which is a verse-by-verse translation of the Bible. When I'm done reading, I'm going to give a recap, kind of a high-level condensed recap of the chapter. Then I'm going to move on to your main point. But what I'm going to do this week that's different is I'm going to give you your main point up front. What we're going to talk about this week is an attribute that you guys all display as a compliment to you. That attribute goes by different names, but we're going to talk about loyalty, faithfulness, and here's an interesting word that I think pegs it really well, fidelity. Fidelity, okay? So as we read through chapter 23, as I read it to you, what I want you to think about as you hear this is how the opposite of that is displayed in today's story. We're in this section of Ezekiel, about 10 chapters or so that are parables. So Ezekiel is going to receive another parable from God, and I'm going to launch into it, New Living Translation. For Donna, for Kay, for some of the other ladies in here, there is very graphic language. Nothing I can do about it. God wrote it. I'm just reading it. Here we go. The title of this is called The Adultery of the Two Sisters. This message came to me from the Lord, Son of Man. It's what Ezekiel was always called by God. Once there were 2 sisters who were daughters of the same mother. They became prostitutes in Egypt. Even as young girls, they allowed men to fondle their breasts. The older girl was named Oholah, and her sister was Aholibah. I married them, and they bore me sons and daughters. I am speaking of Samaria and Jerusalem, for Oholah is Samaria, and I try to practice this all week, guys. Oholibah is Jerusalem. Then Oholah lusted after other lovers instead of me, and she gave her love to the Assyrian officers. They were all attractive young men, captains and commanders dressed in handsome blue, charioteers driving their horses. And so she prostituted herself with the most desirable men of Assyria, worshiping their idols and defiling herself. For when she left Egypt, she did not leave her spirit of prostitution behind. She was still just as lewd as in her youths when the Egyptians slept with her, fondled her breast, and used her as a prostitute. And so I handed her over to the Assyrian lovers, whom she desired so much. They stripped her, took away her children as their slaves, and then killed her. After she received her punishment, her reputation was known to every woman in the land. Yet even when, now this is her younger sister, Aholibah, saw what had happened to Oholah, her sister, she followed right in her footsteps. And she was even more depraved, abandoning herself to her lust and prostitution. She fawned over all the Assyrian officers, those captors and commanders in handsome uniforms, those charioteers driving their horses, all of them attractive young men. I saw the way she was going, defiling herself just like her older sister. Then she carried her prostitution even further. She fell in love with pictures that were painted on a wall, pictures of Babylonian military officers outfitted in striking red uniforms. Handsome belts encircled their waists and flowing turbans crowned their heads. They were dressed like chariot officers from the land of Babylonia. Now, when she saw these paintings, she longed to give herself to them. So she sent messengers to Babylonia to invite them to come to her. So they came and committed adultery with her, defiling her in the bed of love. After being defiled, however, she rejected them in disgust. In the same way, I became disgusted with Aholibah and rejected her, just as I had rejected her sister, because she flaunted herself before them and gave herself to satisfy their lusts. Yet she turned to even greater prostitution, remembering her youth when she was a prostitute in Egypt. She lusted after lovers with genitals as large as donkeys and emissions like those of a horse. And so, Aholibah, you relived your former days as a young girl in Egypt when your first love allowed your breasts to be fondled. Therefore, Aholibah, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will send your lovers against you from every direction, those very nations from which you turned away in disgust. For the Babylonians will come with all the Chaldeans from Pekod and Shoa and Koa, and all the Assyrians will come with them. Handsome young captains, commanders, chariot officers, and other high-ranking officers, all riding their horses. They will come against you from the north with chariots, wagons, and a great army prepared for attack. They will take up positions on every side, surrounding you with men armed with shields and helmets. And I will hand you over to them for punishment, so they can do with you as they please. I will turn my jealous anger against you, and they will deal harshly with you. They will cut off your nose and your ears, and any survivor will then be slaughtered by the sword. Your children will be taken away as captives, and everything that is left will be burned. They will strip you of your beautiful clothes and jewels. In this way, I will put a stop to the lewdness and prostitution you brought from Egypt. You will never again cast longing eyes on those things or fondly remember your time in Egypt. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will surely hand you over to your enemies, to those you loathe, those you rejected. They will treat you with hatred and rob you of all you own, leaving you stark naked. The shame of your prostitution will be exposed to all the world. You brought this on yourself by prostituting yourself to other nations, defiling yourself with all their idols. Because you have followed in your sister's footsteps, I will force you to drink the same cup of terror that she drank. Yes, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You will drink from your sister's cup of terror, a cup that is large and deep. It is filled to the brim with scorn and derision. Drunkenness and anguish will fill you, for your cup is filled to the brim with distress and desolation, the same cup your sister Samaria drank. You will drain that cup of terror to the very bottom. Then you will smash it to pieces and beat your breast in anguish. I, the sovereign Lord, have spoken. And because you have forgotten me and turned your back on me, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You must bear the consequences of all your lewdness and prostitution. Verse 36. The Lord then said to me, Son of man, you must accuse Ohala and Aholibah of all their detestable sins. They have committed both adultery and murder, adultery by worshiping idols, and murder by burning as sacrifices the children they bore to me. Furthermore, they have defiled my temple and violated my Sabbath day. On the very day they sacrificed their children to their idols, they boldly came into my temple to worship. They came in and then defiled my house. You sisters sent messengers to distant lands to get men, and then when they arrived, you bathed yourself, painted your eyelids, put on your finest jewels for them. You sat with them on beautifully embroidered couch and put my incense and my special oil on a table that was spread before you. From your room came the sound of many men carousing. They were lustful men and drunkards from the wilderness who put bracelets on your wrists and beautiful crowns on your heads. Then I said, if they really want to have sex with a worn out prostitute like this, let them. And that is what they did. They had sex with Aholah and with Aholibah, these shameless prostitutes. But righteous people will judge these sister cities for what they really are, adulterers and murderers. Now this is what the sovereign Lord says. Bring an army against them, hand them over to be terrorized and plundered, for their enemies will stone them and kill them with swords. They will butcher their sons and daughters and burn their homes. In this way, I will put an end to the lewdness and idolatry in the land, and my judgment will be a warning to all women not to follow your wicked example. You will be fully repaid for all your prostitution, your worship of idols. Yes, you will suffer the full penalty. Then you will know that I am the sovereign God. Drink break. All right. Would you say that's reasonably self-explanatory? Okay. This is very graphic, and I didn't write it. Even Ezekiel didn't write it. God wrote this. And we're going to get to that in a minute, because this is startling in its vividness and it's what it's picturing. So Ezekiel presents this parable to us kind of in three parts. Verses 1 through 35, he tells this story. An older sister who is Samaria, which is the northern kingdom. Samaria was its capital. And the younger sister, which was Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. These two kingdoms, the northern kingdom Israel, the southern kingdom, represented by these two sisters. And the whoring that he's talking about is idolatry, worshiping false gods and mixing it with the worship of the one true God. And not only did the younger sister follow in the footsteps of the older sister, you have to remember in history, there was about a little over 100 years that separated these two events. And she had plenty of time to change, plenty of time to learn the negative example of what happened to her older sister. Did she learn her lesson? Nope. She not only did it, she did worse things than that. What does that mean? Well, when you get a warning from God and then it's demonstrated by your northern neighbor being destroyed, and then you still go ahead and do it, A, it's worse because that's just stupid. And B, because of this section in here where it talks about letting your children pass through the fire. See, the northern kingdom worshiped the Assyrian gods, but the southern kingdom did much worse. They worshiped the Assyrian gods, they worshiped the Egyptian gods, they worshiped the Babylonian gods, and they worshiped the gods of Canaan. And we'll get a brief history lesson in a minute. But one of those gods of one of the Canaanite people was a god by the name of Molech. And Molech, one of the ways that you would offer sacrifices to him, Molech was displayed by a large bronze statue with two arms outheld like this. And one of the ways that you would bring sacrifice to Molech is they would superheat those arms with fire until they glowed red. The bronze would glow red. And then you would take your newborn child and you would place it in the arms of Molech as a sacrifice. The Israelites were doing this, guys. And that's when God says, this is, I've put up with this for too long and this is too much. So now you see this judgment, this very harsh judgment being pronounced, but I want you to get a flavor why it was pronounced. Now, verses 36 through 39, in case they were so thick-headed and stiff-necked that they didn't get the metaphor, verses 36 through 39, he spells it out. Well, the older sister is the northern kingdom with Samaria, and the younger sister is the southern kingdom with Jerusalem as its capital, and I'm talking about idolatry, not sex. So he spells it out for them in plain English, in case they're like, we don't get it, God. We don't understand all these stories. No, he spells it out for them. And then they closes the parable, verses 40 through 49, and revisits the story of the two sisters. So that's the structure. But to you understand the context, and I practiced this to try to do this in 10 minutes or less. So we're going to strap on our seatbelts. And here we go, the entire history of God's people in 10 minutes with the emphasis on their history of idolatry. Are you ready? Everybody buckled in? Here we go. So God, after he creates the world, man falls and men become desperately wicked after the time of Noah. He wipes out all mankind and starts again with Noah and his family. Now, the population of the world blooms, blossoms, and grows again, and people what people do, they become very wicked. And he goes, all right, different approach. I'm going to bring my message of reconciliation and salvation and redemption to all these people, but I'm going to do it through one people group. So I got to start somewhere. You, third row from the left, Abraham, I'm going to use you. It wasn't anything, I mean, the Jews weren't special. They weren't super intellectual, super powerful, super anything. They were just normal people that God chose to use. Do you understand? You guys are just normal people God chooses you to use. Don't look down your nose at other people because you're a follower of Jesus Christ. God used the descendants of Abraham. So he made some promises to Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, listen, I'm going to make this public vow in front of all the Gentile nations that my blessing and favor is on you, and because of you and through you, you will be my witness and testimony to the whole world, so the whole world can potentially be saved. You get that? Great. So everything's rocking along. They continue to grow in numbers. Jacob is having lots of kids, and there's relatives and descendants, and oops, there's a famine in the land. So Jacob takes the whole clan, and they have to go to Egypt to keep from starving to death. That's how they wound up in Egypt. And while in Egypt, long story, great story on its own, one of Jacob's kids, Joseph, rises through all kinds of adversity, rises to be the second in command of all of Egypt. And so the Jews prospered greatly in Egypt and began to multiply and multiply and multiply. Years and years passed, and the Egyptians are sitting around having coffee one morning. Are you getting a little uncomfortable with the number of Jews that are around here? They're starting to outnumber us. You know, they haven't done anything to us, but if they keep this up, they're going to outnumber us and they're going to overrun us. Why don't we, while we still have the edge, let's put them under our thumb. Let's enslave them. So they did. And so as the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, they stayed in that capacity for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, they're looking around, the Jews are, and go, oh, look at all these beautiful Egyptian gods are all after pretty animals. There's cows and there's camels and there's snakes and there's cats and most of the Egyptian deities were animals, animal gods. And so they began to practice idolatry while still in Egypt and still worshiping God. The syncretism going on. So God listens to their prayers. Oh, free us, free us, free us. And he says, all right, I'm going to free you. Moses, come up front here, buddy, and I'm going to have you be my instrument to free these people. Oh, by the way, before he frees you, I want you to give up these idols. You're not bringing those with you. They did, but anyway, you're not bringing those with you. So Moses frees them. They're out in the wilderness. They're marching on the way to the land flowing of milk and honey, the promised land. All's good. And they're going to get there really soon. They're all looking at their watches. Can't wait, can't wait. And then Moses gets, they had pagers back then. He gets a pager ring from God. God says, Moses, I need to see you up on the mountain because I got some great gifts to give you. It's the law and the commandments. So Moses goes, Aaron, his brother, hold that, watch everybody, make sure they don't eat all the strawberries because I love strawberries, and I got to go talk to God. I'll be back in a minute. So Moses leaves. You know, this is very paraphrased. Moses leaves. Problemo. He's gone for 40 days. So after day 20, you can imagine people go, well, he's probably toast. God probably nuked them on the mountain. Day 30, God's forgotten us. There's no God anymore. Keep in mind, this wasn't 40 years. This wasn't 40 months. This wasn't 40 weeks. This wasn't 40 generations. 40 days these people couldn't last. So they turned to Aaron, Moses' brother, and said, hey, make us one of those gods like we had back in Egypt to get us out of here. And he did. Problem was, Moses wasn't dead. He comes back after 40 days. He's appalled to see what he sees. And God says, that's it. I'm nuking them. I'm up to here with them. They're out. And that's what we studied last week. When Moses did this great thing, when he stood in the gap, remember that was your lesson from last week, standing in the gap. Moses stood in the gap for those people and he said, God, you're right. They're knuckleheads, but you made promises to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that their descendants would number like the stars in the sky. And you made those promises in front of all the Gentile nations, so everybody knows it. And you can't go back on your word. So if you're going to nuke them, God, you need to take my name out of the book of life, and you need to nuke me too. It's one of the greatest intercessory prayers in all the Bible. And God said, all right, I'll only nuke the hardcore offenders. They can carry on. So they go in right to the threshold of the promised land. And then they all put the brakes on. Oh, we can't go in. We're scared. There's too many. We can't do it. So God says, all right, I'm going to have you wander out here in the wilderness for 40 years until every last one of you that refused to have faith in me dies off. I'm going to take care of you. Going to give you manna. Going to protect you. Going to feed you. Going to water you. But you can't go into that choice piece of land that I picked out just for you because you refused. So he does. A whole generation dies out. Then the kids get ready to go into the land of Canaan. And God says, okay, you're about ready to go into this present I prepared for your parents, but they were too stupid and they didn't go in. But you guys get to enjoy it. But I'm all excited. However, got to warn you. You know the problems the gods of the Egyptians caused your parents? He said, there's a lot of gods in Canaan. They're all on little mountaintops with pretty groves and gardens planted around them and little temples and little worship centers. Stay away from those guys. Stay away from them. They're bad for you. They're very bad for you. So the people go in the promised land. They didn't listen. They didn't stay away from it. Time passes on. They're mixing God with other faiths. And then they go, hey, everybody around us has a king. We want a king. God says, no, you don't want a king. No, we want a king. No, kings are bad. They tax you. That's not an anti-tax statement. They tax you. You don't want a king. Oh, we want a king. All right. So God says, I'll give you a king. I'll give you what you ask for. Another story about be careful what you ask and insist on from God. But anyway, he gives them King Saul. King Saul starts out okay, but he starts to fall and get away from God. And the prophet at that time, Samuel's calling him out. Saul, you're messing up. You're messing up, dude. You better back off. You better get right with God. Saul has a kid, Jonathan. He's the heir apparent to the throne. So there's this big burly guy, Goliath, comes on the scene. Oh, I'm the Philistine. You guys can't beat me. Everybody's scared to death. Nobody will take on Goliath, except this young shepherd guy. His name's David. He's not in the king's lineage. He says, oh, this guy's insulting God. I love God. And besides, I'm out in, you guys think this is some skinny teenager? David took care of his father's flocks by himself in the wilderness. Do you know what that means? Remember a couple of weeks ago, we had a little brief foray onto Asiatic lions, that there really was such a thing. And they were very prolific in that area of the Middle East. They're basically like an African lion with a smaller mane. David defended his flocks routinely from all types of predators, including Asiatic lions. So he was no little chicken. So he goes at, you know the story, he slays the giant. He's the people's hero. And he is not in line for the throne. We're going to find out what happens to him in a minute. But David eventually ascends to the throne through a set of circumstances I'll explain after the break. And now you've got this unified Israel. And guys, wasn't very long, but for almost 100 years, and yes, Dan, I see my warning, thank you. For 100 years, which we think that's really not long for a civilization, they were the cream of the crop. Under the reigns of David and Solomon, they were the envy of every nation, both in military power and wealth and riches and culture. They were the pinnacle, the peak. But then due to a sin of David after Solomon's generation, there was a big split, a civil war erupted. And then there was split apart, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom never had a good king after that, not one. They all worshiped idols, they all led their people astray, and eventually they crossed paths with the new world superpower, which is the Assyrians. And they double-crossed the Assyrians, and the Assyrian says, you're going out of here, you're dead. After the break, I'll read you something about that Assyrian conquest. The southern kingdom continued on for over 100 years after the northern kingdom had fallen. And they would have some good kings that would get them right with God, and then they'd have some bad kings that would go back to worship all these Canaanite, Assyrian, and Egyptian gods. So they were like seesaw, up and down. And that brings you to the time of Ezekiel. Now we know what happened. Anybody that sat through me and endured 23 chapters of Ezekiel with me knows that the Babylonians, which if you're going to get conquered by somebody, the Babylonians weren't too bad to get conquered by, not compared to the Assyrians. You'll see in a minute when I read this transcript. But the Babylonians would take them captive for 70 years. And as we mentioned last week, they would learn their lesson. Never again, after the captivity and their punishment was complete, would the Jews ever mess around with idolatry again. Problem solved. All right. So if you want to know the punchline, you got to come back. We have about 35 seconds left. So I'm going to do this like in Looney Tunes, and I will see you guys back here. Quickly sign on as fast as possible because I got to cram all this in by 1. I'll see you back here in a few minutes.